Okay, people. Hope everyone is well. What I'm going to do today is give a little bit of a shout out to this really great book here. It's by David Olson. It's called The World on Paper, and then that's subtitled Reading Consciousness and Rationality. Cannot say enough good things about that book. I mean, David Olson he's probably one of the leading literacy scholars. He is so great, so clear. I mean, if anything, it's so clear and so just goes back over all the different examples in the claims. At a certain point, it almost starts to feel redundant, which I take to be a good sign of a very dense. It's a dense read. It's a very good read, though. I really want to say just all shout outs to it, even though it is a little pricey. So let me say some things about Olson and then see if I can just give a quick rehearsal of some of the main ideas that are going on in this book. And please go check it out. I mean, this guy is really a great scholar. If you've seen his earlier book, he did a book in 1994, I think, called The World on Paper. And this is like a follow-out on that. And I have been doing, follow-up work on his work. I'm going to post a link down below to one of the essays that I wrote that came out about the same time as The World on Paper, but it's very related to some of the stuff that he had been doing in his earlier work. So as far as Olson himself in this particular book, it's just an amazing span of multidisciplinary concern over all the different ways that literacy infiltrates and then shapes our sense of conscious experience. And so I guess the first thing to say is he's really doing a very multidisciplinary project. So he's versed and well schooled in the analytic tradition of philosophy of language. So he's really good at talking about the sort of the new pragmatists. He's bouncing a little bit off of Dewey, but largely from Robert Branham. He references a lot of Frege and talks about Frege's sense and reference distinction, which becomes very important for him. He does a lot of work on Grice and conversational maxims about, the cooperative principle and the different ways that conversations are structured. So he's really good on philosophy of language sort of stuff. Then he's very strong. He's stronger on history of literacy and consciousness work. So all this stuff that goes back to, Marshall McLuhan and Walter Ong and Eric Havelock and Jack Goody, all of the kind of stuff where people are looking at sort of big history and some of the claims that maybe were overstated by some of those folks about the degree to which literacy runs concurrent with, I guess, what we're going to call civilization, right? I mean, for Goody, in some way, speech is sometimes aligned with the human condition, and then writing is aligned with the civilization of the human. And he again, he's been influenced by this, but he wants to keep a kind of a safe distance from some of these perhaps oversweeping claims. And then, like the third area that he is so good at, so versed on, is this issue of I guess, child psychology and children's acquisition of literacy. So he's really good at, Vygotsky in particular. He's like a Vygotskian in some way. He's very versed in Piaget. And I think the book is dedicated to Jerome Bruner, who I believe he was a student of. So he's very familiar with all of the sort of experimental design studies and trying to ferret out exactly what it is that is going on as children move from sort of pre-literate to semi-literate to fully functioning literate adults in modern Western culture. Now, I think one way to set up the argument in the book would be to say this, that he's trying to combat two different fronts. And again, he's doing a lot more than this. I mean, the book is really trying to get people to understand how consciousness is indebted to reading, and a particular kind of consciousness that is consciousness of the language itself, and maybe our rationality about rationality. I mean, that's sort of what he's gunning for. But he's trying to critique, in order to get there, he's trying to critique these sort of trends that are out there in the world. Now, the one I sort of already mentioned when I was talking about, McLuhan and Havelock and Ong, where I think he wants to counter some of these grand narratives that suggest that literacy brought in sweeping changes in the capacity to reason. I mean, it's almost like there are some people who believe that if you're non-literate, or if you live in a society where there is no literacy, or even if you're a child and you're not yet literate, that you're basically irrational, or that you have a deficit in your capacity to reason. And I think what he would say is, well, no, it's more complicated than that. It may well be that there is, yet to learn forms of meta language that enable better reasoning about reasoning. But reasoning per se, the ability to have rational deductions and rational thought, that comes in some way just from speech itself, from, again, larger abilities, the ability to think, to see quantities. So I mean, it's caught within the larger cognitive and computational capacities of the brain, but it does come to a head with language, and language does facilitate a great making of explicit reasons for why one does this or that. Now, it may not be that sophisticated of reasoning about the reasoning, but the reasons are there as soon as a child, I guess, is already familiar enough with language to be able to ask questions about the world, to be able to talk about the world, and to respond, again, in a reasonable way about things. So on that one hand, yeah, he's trying to critique these massive sweeping narratives that set literacy as the fulcrum for Western rationality or something like this. On the other hand, I think he's done a really great job of trying to critique we'll call it the trivialization orientation, where people end up imagining that literacy is just a kind of window dressing, that it has no cognitive impact, that basically reading and writing amounts to record keeping of the spoken word. I think there are some people who really underestimate what it is that literacy does to one's consciousness, to one's memory, to the noetic economy, right? To the way that one's memory functions. What are its resources? How are they tapped? How are they overly drawn upon? How can they be, alleviated and fortified? Well, all of those, they relate to the way literacy makes its taxes upon consciousness, but also frees up consciousness for certain resources. And so I think what he wants to say is that too many people have underestimated the importance of literacy for, and I think he does Winford Sellers' work here on the reason of spaces, that there's a sort of, space of reasons, that there's a space of reasons where we give reasons and we give rationality. And it's as if we've learned how to reason about reason much more effectively. That is, we've learned how to think about the language, not just think about things in the world. And in learning to think about the language, in learning to talk about the language with meta-linguistic resources, meta-representational concepts, we're able to develop, again, capacities to reason about our reasoning, to think about our thinking and ask if we're doing it in the most effective or the most productive ways. Now, okay, so those are some of the main orientations that are going on in the book. Now, I think one of the main claims in the book is that literacy, and we're talking particularly about alphabetic literacy, right? Alphabetic literacy, it brings those implicit elements and dynamics of the spoken word, and it brings them into conscious awareness. We become more and more aware of the precise wording of what someone said. And we start to learn to disentangle what someone said from what they meant. And I think to the oral mind, those are oftentimes equated. So somebody says something like, well, I'm not going to go do that. And then somebody says, in the oral world, try to imagine the oral world. Somebody says, well, I'm not going to do that. And then somebody says, what did you say? And they're using a meta-linguistic word. They said the word say, but the person may not think that much about the particular wording they used. They just may restate what they meant and take that to be synonymous. So let's say something like, well, I said I wasn't going to do it. And you said, well, no, you said something else. It's like, well, no, the attention is to what was meant rather than what was said. The oral mind will have a tendency to equivocate those and almost act as if what someone heard by the meant, well, that was what was said. And there again, that rigid, clear distinction that maybe literates can draw between the said and the meant, it's not as sharp. Now, clearly, People who are oral do speak about the language. They can say something like, "What's that? Did you mean that?" And when they're asking about the language, they're asking about what you meant. They're asking about the reference to what was that's we're using language in a certain way, and they want to know what it was that you were trying to refer to or to mean. They're not so much trafficking in this fine-tooth haggle over the wording you used to convey that meaning. In fact, see, now this comes back to this claim that Vygotsky gives, that I think Olson does a lot of time trying to defend and clarify, which is that roughly the claim is that for native speakers in the oral situation, language is largely transparent. Now, when I say it's largely transparent, I mean that you don't really attend to the language itself. You attend to what the language is about. And so, somebody says to you, "Hey, this summer I'm going to go horseback riding in Mexico." And you're like, "Oh, really? How long are you staying?" And there, we're sort of talking about the trip. We're talking about horseback riding. We're talking about Mexico. We're talking about this summer versus how long are you staying. That's very different than if I say I'm going to go horseback riding in Mexico this summer and somebody says, "What's a horse?" Okay, now when they ask what's a horse, it's still, I guess, in language about the world. I could say, well, a horse is an animal that you ride. They're available down in Mexico. They're actually pretty cheap when you go down there. There's a lot of different tours that make them available. And again, I'm still talking about the word. But now the person says, "Well, I really don't understand. Like, you said the word horse. I don't know what that word means." Okay. Now they're talking about the word horse. We're not talking about horses. We're not talking about the four-legged animal, the mammal that I get on and ride. Now we're talking about a word that is made up of letters, begins with the letter H, ends with the letter E, right? Rhymes with various words like course. Now we're in a different realm where we're talking about the language as an object of awareness rather than just the world itself. And although oral peoples clearly do have some experience of getting out of language transparency, as I said, they could maybe say to somebody, "What did you say?" And again, the language wasn't transparent. They're aware of something being meant that they weren't understanding, but there'll be a tendency to just not be concerned with the particular wording, just try to hear again and understand what was being meant by what was said. But the literate, they introduce a different distinction. And this, Olson claims, and I think rightly so, is the use mention distinction. The use mention distinction. There is such an important distinction between a word as it's used and a word as it's mentioned. The word as it's used generally does have that transparency, and it's about its referent, or it's about its meaning. The word as mentioned is sort of like the word as a metalinguistic object that now we're conscious of in its own right. And he again, Olson rightly points out that it was modern philosophy that brought the use mention distinction into play, and it solved all kinds of riddles. I mean, the ancient world, even, go back to Aristotle, the Stoics, and the Stoics were very good at logic. They were very good at laying out, problems of inference, but they weren't able to clearly and consistently make the use mention distinction, and it just muddled thinking endlessly. If you go to the lives of Diogenes Laertius, the lives of eminent philosophers by Diogenes Laertius, in there he talks about some of the riddles that had plagued people in the ancient world. And they would say something like this. They'd say, "Now, mice eat cheese." And the guy would say, "Yeah, mice eat cheese." And the guy would say, "Mouse is a word." The guy would say, "Okay, yeah, mouse is a word." And then he says, "So words eat cheese." And they were sort of stumbled with this because, again, they weren't able to keep clear the difference between meta language and, I guess, object language, or between language as it's being used and language as it's just being mentioned. And it creates all kinds of confusion. And sometimes we are talking about things by way of words, and the words are largely transparent. We don't even attend to them. Other times we are focused explicitly on the words themselves and on the particular semantic relations, maybe on dictionary definitions, this kind of stuff. Now, there are a lot of different ways to explain and clarify what it means to say that language is largely transparent to pre-literates or oral peoples, young children. One of the, again, just sort of fascinating examples he gives in the text. He says they go up to young children and they ask them for an example of a really long word and a really short word. And it's funny when you ask a very young child, right? Someone who has very little or no exposure to literacy, again, very, very, very modest exposure to literacy, they will say something like a long word. They'll go, oh, the word train. Yeah, train's a long word. Because they're thinking about the object of meaning that comes through when they use the word. Like, it's almost like they're unaware of the word as word, and they use it as a vehicle to think about the object train. And they go, yeah, train is a long word. And you say, well, how about caterpillar? Is caterpillar a long word? Child says, no, caterpillars, sure, they're tiny. Caterpillars are, especially compared to a train. They're thinking about the world through the language. They're not giving scrupulous attention to the wording or the words themselves. He sort of says it this way, that, if you whistle, I mean, you can whistle a song and you can kind of keep it in tune, and you're very aware of the particular notes and is it hitting the right notes for that song, but you're wholly unaware of how your mouth is pursed, how you're blowing, all the different dynamics, like physiologically in your mouth, that are pulling off that sound. And it's sort of like he's suggesting a sort of parallel there, that we're able to speak and able to accomplish lots of meanings without necessarily becoming explicitly aware of the process in doing so, although literacy does hold that possibility. It kind of opens up the door for increasing awareness of not what we're creating by literacy, but what had always already been there, but just never really been adequately attended to. So, another example here. Classic examples here, right? So they have, this is from Luria's study of illiterate peasants. They would say something, and this, now we're going to like Grice's maxims, right? He does a lot of work on showing how when we move toward testing people to see if they, quotes, have become rational or not, or how much rationality do they have without the resources of literacy. And he says, a lot of this stuff has been misunderstood because we've assumed that people are irrational, when actually it may be that they're operating by a different set of principles. And he invokes Grice here in Grice's conversational maxims, that we only give what's relevant, and that it has to be a certain amount, and it has to be like dialogically related to what was said, this kind of stuff, right? So, and there is something like an awareness of different genres of utterance there. So they take an illiterate peasant and they say, Navoya lives up in the north. Now, up in the north, there are only white bears. Navoya sees a bear. What color is the bear? See, and I think when they ask the illiterate peasant this question, they go, I don't know, it could be any color bear. There's all kinds of bears. And the researchers at the time went, well, look, see, these oral peoples, they're unable to draw the correct inference from the stated premises that it would be a white bear. And what Olson comes in and says, no, you can't draw that inference from that study. No, what you're really doing is tapping into different metalinguistic orientations. And it may be that the particular person you're talking to is not willing to concede that what you said was a legitimate premise, that inferences can be drawn from it. From them, it could just be a wild conjecture. Right. So there's a sense in which when we think of logic and modus ponens, modus tollens, again, going all the way back to Aristotle, right? We have some sense of entailments of things being logically inferenceable, but that already presupposes that we see them as a premise to a conclusion in a syllogistic way. There are other ways of using speech, more everyday speech in its use, where we don't attend to the sense of the words. We're kind of tending to the reference, and then we're asking questions about, do they actually follow this out? And it could well be that they're having just fundamental disagreements about how much trust people can put in what was said literally, right? They hear it as, well, I'm not sure if I can believe what is being meant by what is said there, right? Again, they're at variance there. Another really interesting example that he gives is they take children and they set them down in front of two pictures. And the one picture has 3 rabbits. The other picture has 2 ducks. And then the experimenter looks at the child, looks at the photographs, and he says, now, are there more rabbits or more animals? The child says, rabbits. And then the parent, the person who's doing the interview is like, look, see, the child's unable to see the difference. They're not thinking categorically. They didn't realize that animals is a bigger category than either animals or ducks. And they're unable to draw inferences correctly from stated premises, blah, blah, blah. Again, Olson comes in and says, no. You cannot draw that inference from that at all. The child could be just obeying something like Grice's maxims of conversation. That it's sort of like the child is listening to what is meant rather than, they're not attending to the actual words. And they kind of are stuck with not thinking the speaker would be so stupid as to ask an obvious question. Like the child can see that there's 3 rabbits and 2 ducks. But when they heard the question, it's almost like they heard what they think the speaker meant and just took that to be synonymous with what the speaker said. And they're sort of like giving the questioner the benefit of the doubt of not having asked such a stupid, obvious question. And again, for this, it does give pretty solid evidence that people are able to think and reason in an oral way, to give reasons that justify how they're thinking. But there is something significant that happens with literacy. Now, I guess the way to shake this out even further is to say that if you go up to your average literate adult today, your average person, right, who's on the street, gone to high schools, had extensive schooling, maybe even some college, maybe even has a college degree, if you would try to tell them that speech is made up of words, and spoken words comprise sentences, and then sentences are the smallest unit for which we can ask, is that statement true or false? They would probably be inclined to go, yeah, what's the big deal? Where's the controversial statement? There's, we who have become literate, we think in terms of words and sentences. But these are fairly unknown and novel, right? They're very novel, at least historically, and certainly for oral peoples, that they have a notion of, again, what was meant. They're talking about items in the world, things of the world. There might be some sort of idea unit that's referenced, but the notion of a word as a word, that is a thing that's found in the dictionary that can be talked about in the abstract in terms of it, what letters make it up, what words rhyme with it, how does an alliteration to what other words, all of those are the word as mentioned. They're largely the word as sense, and they're the word removed from our everyday use of the words. Now, they come back to it for sure. And what happens is, over the centuries, especially over, say, the last 200 years with mass education, the wide distribution of literacy, the proliferation of dictionaries, all the ways in which, mass education has brought illiteracy rates to, all-time low across the globe. It's made people very aware of words and of sentences, and of being able to think about things that way. And it's brought with it and institutionalized all kinds of meta language. There's language for referring to what we do when we speak. So a word like word, a word like sentence, a word like language, a word like dictionary, right? We now, and we shift back and forth, oftentimes without noticing it, between talking about things in the world like, oh, I really like that movie, blah, 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 it was really good. I don't think the acting was that good. And then somebody says, well, what was your favorite movie? And you say, well, okay, I'm talking about this movie. And then suddenly they could ask, I didn't even know what the movie meant until I started to look at different genres of films. And, I realized this kind of film is different than that kind of film. And now all of a sudden we're talking about things, but we're starting to move into more and more meta language. And we often do it seamlessly. We're kind of bobbling back and forth between talking about the world, talking about what we said, and we don't just gloss over it and go, well, there was no distinction between what I said and what I meant. We make a distinction between verbatim statement and paraphrase. It's one of the key distinctions in literacy. Again, we make a notion of verbatim. So somebody says, well, I don't want to go to the store today. And you go, what did you say? And you say, hey, I said no store for me. Now, we might say, well, those said the same thing. I said the same thing. Well, to the literate person, like, no, you didn't. You used different words. The phrasing was different. The wordology, all that stuff, it was tiny little differences there. You're like, well, I meant the same thing. I think to the oral mind, the meaning is really the only thing they're really paying attention to. The way of expressing it, again, is largely transparent. And even for all of us, when we're talking with people, sometimes we're like lost in the story. And we're not thinking so much about the particular word choices that were being made. Instead, as we try to retell the story, we try to retell the story as we understood it, as it was meant to us. And it may be certain phrases that we want to recall to really help drive that home. Again, we're literate. To the oral mind, when they hear a story, they may feel as if they've adequately repeated it quite perfectly if they've got the meaning across, even though the words themselves may have changed significantly. Right? I mean, that was Albert Lord's Singer of Tales. Again, a very fascinating book that Olson does a lot more with in his earlier book. But, Lord, with following out Milman Perry's work, they had went and they found illiterate peasants who were able to sing oral tales. And they've said that they've sung these oral tales, the same tales, for centuries and centuries. Well, then he took tape recorders there and he recorded the songs. Then he recorded the song at a different occasion, then a different occasion. And he went, look, you're not singing the same song. Here you use this turn of phrase. Here you use that turn of phrase. And the people are like, no, it's the same song. I'm saying the same thing. And they're like, no, you're not. You're saying different things. Look at the words. And it dawned upon people that there is a very key distinction between paraphrase and verbatim. If verbatim is exactly those words. And we do have a sense of that. Now, even without pen and paper, like right here as I'm talking right now, I don't know if you're writing notes down. My guess is you're not. You're just listening. But even though we're just speaking orally with one another, our discourse is highly literate, largely because it's populated with countless metalinguistic, meta-representational terms. I'm able to represent how I represent things. So I can talk about my thought about this book. I can talk about the different ways in which the book was written and the various turns of phrase that he uses. He asks young children something like, is it true or false that some elephants have trunks? When people are pre-literate, I think they kind of go, yeah, some elephants have trunks. As you get literate, you become more and more attentive to the wording per se, and you'd be like, well, that wouldn't be the way you'd say it. You'd say all elephants have trunk. Now, there may be an exception to that. But we have a tendency to think, well, that's what I mean by an elephant, as a large pachyderm, whatever, right? That has a trunk. And again, when you ask about a word and you say, what does that word mean? And the person says, well, it means this or that. And they just give other kinds of ways of thinking about that item. If I say, well, what is a horse? You say, well, a horse is something that can, you can ride in a cart with, or something. A horse is something you can ride on, or a horse is something that you have to brush their mane. That's very different than going, how do you define a horse? Well, now you're doing this. Well, it's a mammal, four-legged quadruped. You do all this kind of stuff, which is, it's all mention, and it's all words being used for other words for other words. You've now left the world of flesh and blood, and you're in the world of paper and of ink and pencil. We as moderns we're not necessarily in any way intellectually superior to oral peoples. It's not as if civilization itself has come with literacy. There are forms of reasoning that are endemic to the ability to think and speak. And we use speech for articulate thought. We do make decisions. We're able to make reasons for things. But our reasoning about reasoning, our ability to get clear on why reasons are good or not. Are they effective? Do they logically follow or not? How rigorously are we sure that the premises and the evidence are all related to the conclusions drawn? That would be reasoning about reasoning. And I think that's really the strong point of literacy. And so part of the, I guess I'll wrap up with, part of the real deal is that so many people, when they think about literacy, they think about it as, illiteracy rates and what will happen if people don't become literate. And there's gang membership correlations with illiteracy rates. And there's a lot of concern about what happens if people can't learn to read and can't learn to write. And that is a significant concern. But unfortunately, so many people just think of reading and writing as a skill that's needed for them, again, to get a job or do other things. They seem to be underestimating the degree to which literacy is more than just a skill of reading and writing. It's a skill that helps us learn to think about our thinking more clearly. It helps us to give reasons about our reasoning much more clearly. And to that extent, even if literacy has not brought about sweeping transformation and made people rational in ways that they were not rational, it certainly does do more than just, write down what we've said. No, it does introduce various transformations. Maybe not transformations in the whole consciousness. Maybe it doesn't revolutionize consciousness. Maybe it doesn't transform consciousness, say, as Walter Ong suggested, but it certainly does significantly, especially through time as we institutionalize social normative practices for using dictionaries, for being able to talk about our reasons, not just give reasons, but to ask, is that reason a good reason? See, there you're going to need the meta language of the word reason, the word, right? As soon as you're in that realm, we do have a kind of reasoning that I think we want to be very careful not to let go of. As people let literacy sort of fall by the wayside, yeah, they may still be able to reason and they're still going to be able to think, but how robustly will they be able to reason about their reasoning? I don't know. I think there is some evidence that we can learn logic and mathematics, but you're going to need a pen and paper for that. You're not going to do a lot of sophisticated logic and a lot of sophisticated math without pen and paper. And then the carryover is all of the meta-linguistic and meta-representational resources that can be spontaneously brought to bear in our everyday language. Okay, people, hope all is well. And okay, please go check out David Olson's book. It's a great book. Okay, bye.